Your sense of who you are will determine your actions and what you end up getting in life. If you see your reach as limited, that you are mostly helpless in the face of so many difficulties, that it is best to keep your ambitions low, then you will receive the little that you expect. Knowing this dynamic, you must train yourself for the opposite. Ask for more, aim high, and believe that you are destined for something great. Your sense of self worth comes from you alone, never the opinion of others. With a rising confidence in your abilities, you will take risks that will increase your chances of success. People follow those who know where they are going, so cultivate an air of certainty and boldness. The hustler's ambition. Here's a quote by James Baldwin. Let me point out to you that freedom is not something that anybody can be given. Freedom is something people take, and people are as free as they want to be. Curtis Jackson's mother, Sabrina, had one powerful ambition in her life, to somehow make enough money to move her and her son far away from the hood. She had Curtis when she was 15, and the only reasonable outlet at that age for making any good money was dealing drugs. It was a particularly dangerous life for a female hustler, and so she built up an intimidating presence to protect herself. She was tougher and more fearless than many of the male dealers. Her only soft spot was her son. She wanted a different fate for him other than hustling. To shelter him from the life she led, she had him stay with her parents in Southside Queens. As often as possible, she would show up with presents for the boy and keep an eye on him. Someday soon they would move to a better place. As part of a drug beef, Sabrina was murdered at the age of 23, and from that moment on, it looked like Curtis's fate in this world had been sealed. He was now essentially alone, no parents or real mentor to give him a sense of direction. It seemed almost certain that the following scenario would play itself out. He would drift towards life on the streets. To prove his toughness, he would eventually have to resort to violence and crime. He would find his way in the prison system and would probably return for several stints. His life would basically be confined to this neighborhood, and as he got older, he could turn to drugs or alcohol to see him through, or at best, a series of menial jobs. All the statistics pointed towards this limited life and bleak future. And yet, in his mind, something much different was taking shape. With his mother gone, he spent more and more time alone and began to indulge himself in fantasies that carried him far beyond his neighborhood. He saw himself as a leader of some sort, perhaps in business or in war. He visualized in great detail the places he would live, the cars he would drive, the outside world he would someday explore. It was a life of freedom and possibility, but these were not mere fantasies, they were real. They were destined to happen. He could see them clearly. Most important, he felt that his mother was looking after him. Her energy and ambition were inside him now. Oddly enough, he will follow in her footsteps with the same plan, to hustle and get out of the game. To avoid her fate, he forged an intense belief that nothing could stop him, not a gunshot, the schemes of other hustlers, or the police. These streets would not confine him. In May of 2000, Curtis, now known as 50 Cent, somehow survived the 9 bullets that a hired assassin had pumped into his body. The timing of the attack had been particularly poignant. After years of hustling on the streets and in music, his first album had been about to come out. But then, in the aftermath of the shooting, Columbia Records canceled the album and dropped him from the label. He would have to start all over. In the months to come, as he laid in bed recovering from his wounds, he began to reconstruct himself mentally, much as he had done after the murder of his mother. He saw in his mind, in even fresher detail than ever, the path he would now take. He would conquer the rap world with the mixtape campaign with the likes of which no one had seen before. It would come from his intense energy, his persistence, the even tougher sound he would create, and the image he would now project of an indestructible gangster. Within a year of the shooting, he was on his way to making this vision a reality. His first songs hit the streets and created a sensation. As he progressed on his path, however, he saw one very important impediment still blocking his path. The assassins were looking to finish the job and they can show up at any moment. 50 was forced to keep a low profile and stay on the run, but this feeling of being hunted was intolerable. He would not live this way, and so he decided he needed a group of tight-knit disciples who would help protect him and overcome his sense of isolation. To make this a reality, he told his closest friends to convene a meeting in his grandparents' house in Southside, Queens. They were to invite his most fervent fans in the neighborhood, the young men whom they knew to be loyal and dependable, and they should bring all the guns to help secure the street before 50 showed up. When 50 finally entered the living room of his grandparents' house the day of the meeting, he could feel the energy and excitement. The space was filled with over 20 young men all ready to do his bidding. He began by painting for them his precise vision of the future. His music was now hot, but it was going to get a lot hotter. Within 2 more years, he was certain to land a major record deal. In his head, he already could hear the songs for his first record, visualize the cover and the overall concept. It would be the story of his life. This record, he assured them, would be an astronomical success because he had figured out a kind of formula for how to make and market hit songs. He was not the usual rap star, he explained. He was not in this for the bling or the attention, but for the power. He would take the money from his record sales to establish his own businesses. This was destiny. Everything in his life was meant to happen as it did, including the assassination attempt, including this very meeting this afternoon. He was going to forge a business empire, and he wanted to take all of them with him. Whatever any of them wanted, he would provide as long as they proved themselves dependable and shared his sense of purpose. They could be rappers on a record label he would establish, or road managers for his tours, or they could go to college and get a degree. He would pay for it all. You are like my pack of wolves, he explained, but none of this will happen if the alpha wolf is killed. What he asked was their help in providing security and keeping in touch with what was happening on the streets, and in doing some of the legwork for the promotion and distribution of his mixtapes. He needed followers, and he had chosen them. Almost all of them agreed to the proposal, and over the years to come, many of them stayed on to gain the most important positions within his expanding empire. And if they ever stopped to think about it, it was uncanny how close the future had come to resemble the picture that he had painted so many years before. By 2007, after the tremendous success of his first 2 records, 50 began to sense a problem looming on the horizon. He had created an image for the public, a 50 myth that centered on his tough and menacing presence and indestructibility. This was projected in his videos and interviews and photos of him with his glare and tattoos. Most of it was real, but it was all heightened for dramatic effect. This image he had bought him great attention, but it was turning into an elaborate trap. To prove his fans that he was still the same 50, he would have to keep upping the ante, engaging in more and more outrageous antics. He could not afford to seem like he was going soft, but it was not real to him anymore. He had moved on to a different life, and to stay rooted in this past image would prove to be the ultimate limit to his freedom. He would be trapped in the past and a prisoner of the very image he had created. It would all grow stale, and his popularity would wane. In each phase of his life, he had found himself challenged by some seemingly insurmountable obstacle, surviving on the streets without parents to guide him, keeping away from the violence and time in prison, and eluding the assassins on his heels, etc. If at any moment he had doubted himself or accepted the normal limits to his mobility, he would be dead or powerless, which was as good as dead in his mind. What had saved him in each case was the intensity of his ambition and self-belief. Now was not the time to get complacent or have doubts about the future. He would have to transform himself again. He would have his signature tattoos removed. Perhaps he would also change his name again. He would create a new image and a myth to fit this period of his life. Part business, part mogul, part power broker, slowly withdrawing from the public eye and flexing his muscles behind the scenes. This would surprise the public, keep him a step ahead of their expectations, and remove yet another barrier to his freedom. Reinventing himself in this way would be the ultimate reversal of the fate that seemed to await him after the death of his mother. The hustler's approach. Here's a quote by 50 Cent. Your opinion of yourself becomes your reality. If you have all of these doubts, then no one will believe in you and everything will go wrong. If you think the opposite will happen. It's that simple. When you were born, you entered this world with no identity or ego. You were simply a bundle of chaotic impulses and desires. But slowly, you acquired a personality that you have more or less built upon over the years. You are outgoing or shy, bold or skittish, a mix of various traits that defines you. You tend to accept this personality as something very real and established. But much of this identity is shaped and constructed by outside forces, the opinions and judgments of hundreds of other people who have crossed your path over the years. This process began with your parents. As a child, you paid close attention to what they said about you, modeling your behavior to win their approval and love. You closely monitored their body language to see what they liked and didn't like. Much of this had a tremendous impact on your evolution. If, for example, they commented about your shyness, it could easily strengthen any tendencies you had in that direction. You suddenly became aware of your own awkwardness and it stuck inside you. If you had something different trying to encourage you in your skills and draw you out, it might have had a much different impact. Either way, shyness is a fluid quality. It fluctuates according to the situation and the people you are around. Don't ever be felt as it should never be felt as a set personality trait. And yet these judgments from family, friends, and teachers are given inordinate weight and become internalized. Many of these criticisms and opinions are not objective at all. People want to see certain qualities in you. They project onto you their own fears and fantasies. They want you to fit a conventional pattern. It is frustrating and often frightening for people to think they cannot figure someone out. Behavior that is considered abnormal or different, which may very well be coming from somewhere deep within you, is actively discouraged. Envy plays a role as well. If you are too good at something, you might be made to feel strange or undesirable. Even the praise of others is often designed to hem you into certain ideals they want to see in you. All of this shapes your personality, limits your range of behavior, and becomes like a mask that hardens on your face. Understand, you are in fact a mystery to yourself. You began life as someone completely unique, a mix of qualities that will never be repeated in the history of the universe. In your earliest years, you are a mass of conflicting emotions and desires. Then something foreign to you is placed over this reality. Who you are is much more chaotic and fluid than this surface character. You are full of untapped potential and possibility. As a child, you had no real power to resist this process, but as an adult, you could easily rebel and rediscover your individuality. You could stop deriving your sense of identity and self-worth from others. You could experiment and push past the limits people have set for you. You could take action that is different from what they expect, but that is to incur a risk. You are being unconventional, perhaps a bit strange in the eyes of those who know you. You could fail in this action and be ridiculed. Conforming to people's expectations is safer and more comfortable, even if doing so makes you miserable and confined. In essence, you are afraid of yourself and what you could become. Shh, I can relate to that 100%, baby. There is another fearless way of approaching your life. It begins by untying yourself from the opinions of others. This is not as easy as it sounds. You're breaking a lifelong habit of continually referring to other people when measuring your value. You must experiment and feel the sensation of not concerning yourself with what others think or expect of you. You do not advance or retreat with their opinions in mind. You drown out their voices that often translate into doubts inside of you. Instead of focusing on the limits you have internalized, you think of the potential you have for new and different behavior. Your personality can be altered and shaped by your conscious decision to do so. We barely understand the role that willpower plays in our actions. When you raise your opinion of yourself and what you are capable of, and what you are capable of, it has a decided influence on what you do. For instance, you feel more comfortable taking some risks, knowing that you will always be able to get back up after on your feet if it fails. Taking this risk will then make your energy levels rise. You have to meet the challenge or go under. You will find untapped reservoirs of creativity within you. People are drawn to those who act boldly, and their attention and faith in you will have some effect in heightening your confidence. Feeling less confined by doubts, you are giving freer rein to your individuality, which makes everything you do more effective. This movement towards confidence has a self-fulfilling quality that is impossible to deny. Moving towards such self-belief does not mean you cut yourself off from others and their opinions of your actions. You must take constant measure of how people receive your work and use to maximum effect their feedback. But this process must begin from a position of inner strength. If you are dependent on their judgments for your self-worth, then your ego will always be weak and fragile. You will have no center or sense of balance. You will wilt under criticisms and soar too high with any praise. Their opinions are merely helping you shape your work, not your self-image. If you make mistakes, if the public judges you negatively, you have an unshakable inner core that can accept such judgments, but you remain convinced of your own truth. In impoverished environments like the hood, people's sense of who they are and what they deserve is continually under attack. People from the outside tend to judge them for where they come from, as violent, dangerous, or untrustworthy. As if the accident of where they were born determines who they are. Perhaps deep inside, feel that they don't deserve much of what is considered good in the world. Those from the hood who want to overcome this pronouncement of the outside world have to fight with double the energy and desperation. They have to convince themselves first that they are worth more, they are worth much more, and can rise as far as they want through willpower. The intensity of their ambition becomes the deciding factor. It has to be supremely high. That is why most ambitious and confident figures in history often emerge from the most impoverished and arduous of circumstances. For those of us who live outside such an environment, ambition has almost become a dirty word. It is associated with such historical types as Richard III or Richard Nixon. It reeks of insecurity and evil deeds to reach the top. People who want power so badly must have psychological problems, or so we think. Much of this social prudery around the idea of power and ambition comes from an unconscious guilt and desire to keep other people down. To those occupying a position of privilege, the ambitiousness from those from below seems like something scary and threatening. If you come from relative prosperity, you are more than likely tainted with some of the prejudice, and you must extirpate it as much as possible. If you believe ambition is ugly and needs to be disguised or repressed, you will have to tiptoe around others, making a show of false humility in two minds every time you contemplate some necessary power move. If you see it as beautiful as the driving force behind all great human accomplishments, then you will feel no guilt in raising your level of ambition as high as you want and pushing aside those who block your path. One of the most fearless men in history has to be the great 19th century abolitionist Frederick Douglass. He was born in the cruelest system known to man, slavery. It was designed in every detail to destroy a person's spirit. It did so by separating people from their families so that they can develop no real emotional attachments in their lives, aka single-parent homes. It used constant threats and fear to break any sense of free will, and it has made sure that slaves were kept illiterate and ignorant. They were to form only the lowest opinions of themselves. Douglass himself suffered all of these fates as a child, but somehow his earliest years, he believed that he was worth much more, that something powerful had been crushed, but that it could spring back to life. As a child, he saw himself escaping the clutches of slavery someday, and he nourished himself on that dream. Then in 1828, at the age of 10, Douglass was sent by his master to work in a home of a son-in-law in Baltimore, Maryland. Douglass read this as some kind of providence working in his favor. It meant that he would escape the hard labor of the plantation and would have more time to think. In Baltimore, the mistress of the house was constantly reading the Bible, and one day he asked her if she could teach him to read. She happily obliged, and he quickly learned. The master of the house learned of this and severely upbraided his wife. A slave must never be allowed to read and write. He forbade her to continue with the teachings. Douglass, however, could manage on his own, getting books and dictionaries for himself on the sly. Memorized famous speeches, which he could go over in his mind any time of the day. He saw himself becoming a great orator, railing against the evils of slavery. With growing knowledge of the outside world, he came to resent even more bitterly that the life he was forced to lead disinfected his attitude. His owner sensed it. At the age of 15, he was sent to a farm run by Mr. Covey, whose sole task in life was to break the spirit of a rebellious slave. Covey, however, was not successful. Douglass had already created in his mind an identity for himself that would not match what Covey wanted to impose on him. This image of his own high value, believed in with all his energy, would become reality. He maintained his inner freedom and sanity. He converted all of the whippings and the mistreatment into a spur for him to escape to the north. It gave him more materials to someday share with the world on the evils of slavery. Several years later, Douglass managed to escape to the north. There he became a leading abolitionist, eventually founding his own newspaper and always pushing against the limits people tried to impose on him. Understand, people will constantly attack you in life. One of their main weapons will be to instill in you doubts about yourself, your worth, your abilities, your potential. They will often disguise this as their objective opinion, but invariably, it has a political purpose. They want to keep you down. You are continually prone to believe these opinions, particularly if your self-image is fragile. In every moment of life, you can defy and deny people of this power. You do so by maintaining a sense of purpose, a high destiny you are fulfilling. From such a position, people's attacks do not harm you, they only make you angry and more determined. The higher you raise this self-image, the fewer judgments and manipulations you will tolerate. This will translate into fewer obstacles in your path. If someone like Frederick Douglass could forge this attitude amid the most unfree of circumstances, then we surely should be able to find our own way to such inner strength. Keys to Fearlessness. Here's a quote by Fyodor Dostoevsky. One's own free, untamed desires, one's own whim, all of this is precisely that which fits no classification and which is constantly knocking all systems and theories to hell. And where did our sages get the idea that man must have a normal, virtuous desires? What man needs is only his own independent wishing, whatever that independence may cost and whatever it may lead. In today's world, our idea of freedom largely revolves around the ability to satisfy certain needs and desires. We feel free if we can gain the kind of employment we desire, buy the things we want, and engage in a wide range of behavior as long as it does not harm others. According to this concept, freedom is something essentially passive. It is given and guaranteed to us by our government, often by not meddling in our affairs and various social groups. There is, however, a completely different concept of liberty. It is not something that people grant us as a privilege or right. It is a state of mind that we must work to attain and hold on to with much effort. It is something active and not passive. It comes from exercising free will. In our day-to-day affairs, much of our actions are not free and independent. We tend to conform to society's norms in behavior and thinking. We generally act out of habit without much of thought as to why we do things. When we act with freedom, we ignore the pressures to conform. We step beyond our usual routines. Asserting our will and our individuality, we move on our own. Let us say we have a career that affords us enough money to live comfortably and offers us a reasonable future. But this job is not deeply satisfying. It does not lead us anywhere we want to go. Perhaps we also have to deal with a boss who is difficult and imperious. Our fears for the future, our comfortable habits, and our sense of propriety will compel us to stay on. All of these factors and forces are forces that limit and confine us. But at any moment, we could let go of the fear and leave the job, not really certain of where we are headed, but confident we can do better. In that moment, we have exercised free will. It initiates from our own deepest desire and need. Once we leave, our mind must rise to the challenge. To continue on this path, we have to take more independent actions because we cannot depend on habits or friends to see us through. Free action has a momentum of its own. Many will argue that this idea of active freedom is basically an illusion. We are products of our environments, so they say. If people become successful, it is because they benefited from certain favorable social circumstances. They were at the right place at the right time. They got the proper education and mentoring. Their willpower played a part, no doubt, but a small part. If circumstances were different, so the argument goes, these types would have not had the success they had, no matter how strong their willpower. All kinds of statistics and studies can be trotted out to support this argument, but in the end, this concept is merely a product of our times and the emphasis on passive freedom. It chooses to focus on circumstance and environment as if exceptionally free actions of Frederick Douglass could also be explained by his physiology or the luck he had in learning to read. In the end, such a philosophy wants to deny the essential freedom we all possess to make a decision independent of outside forces. It wants to diminish individuality. We are just products of a social process, they imply. Understand, at any moment, you could kick this philosophy and its ideas in the trash can by doing something irrational and unexpected, contrary to what you have done in the past, and act not possibly explained by your upbringing or nervous system. What prevents you from taking such action is not mommy, daddy, or society, but your own fears. You are essentially free to move beyond any limits others have set for you to recreate yourself as thoroughly as you wish. If you've had some terribly painful experience in the past, you could choose to let that pain sit there and you could soak in it. On the other hand, you could decide to convert it into anger, a cause to promote some form of action. Or you could choose to simply drop it and move on, relishing in the freedom and power that brings you. That brings you. No one can take away these oppositions or force your response. Your options or force your response. It is all up to you. Moving to this more active form of freedom doesn't mean you are giving yourself over to wild and inconsidered action. Your decision to alter a career path, for instance, is based on a careful consideration of your strengths and deepest desires and the future you want. If it comes from thinking for yourself and not accepting what others think of you, the risks you take are not emotional and for the sake of a thrill. They are calculated. The need to conform and to please others will always play a role in our actions, consciously or unconsciously. To be completely free is impossible and undesirable. You are merely exploring a freer range of action in your life and the power it could bring you. What blocks us from moving in this direction are the pressures we feel to conform, our rigid habitual patterns of thinking, and our self-doubts and fears. The following are 5 strategies to help you push past these limits. The first strategy, defy all categories. As a young girl growing up in Kansas at the turn of the 20th century, Amelia Earhart felt oddly out of place. She liked to do things her own way, play rough games with the boys, spending hours by herself reading books or disappearing on long hikes. She was prone to behavior that others considered strange and unorthodox. At boarding school, she was kicked out for walking on a roof in her nightgown. As she got older, she felt intense pressure to settle down and be more like other girls. Earnhardt had an abhorrence, however, of marriage and the constructions it had represented constrictions that it had represented for women. So she looked for a career by trying her hands at all kinds of jobs. But she craved adventure and challenges, and the jobs available to her were menial and mindless. Then one day in 1920, she went for a short ride in an airplane and suddenly knew she had found her calling. She took lessons and became a pilot. In the air, she felt the freedom that she had always been looking for. Piloting a plane was a constant challenge, physical and mental. She could express the daring side of her character, her love for adventure, as well as her interest in the mechanics of flying. Female pilots at the time were not taken seriously. The men who were the ones who set the records and blazed new paths. To combat this, Earnhardt had to push the limits as far as she could, doing feats of flying that could make headlines and contribute to something to the profession. In 1932, she became the first woman to pilot a plane across the Atlantic in what would turn out to be the most death-defying and physically arduous flight. In 1935, she contemplated doing a crossing of the Gulf of Mexico. One of the most famous male pilots of the time told her that it was too dangerous and not worth the risk. Feeling there was a challenge in this, she decided to attempt the flight anyway and manage it with relative ease, showing others how it could be done. If at any moment in her life she had succumbed to the pressures to be more like the others, she would have lost that magic that seemed to follow her and when she went her own direction. She decided to continue being herself, whatever the consequences might be. She dressed in her own unconventional manner and spoke her mind on political matters, even though that was considered unbecoming. When the famous publicist and promoter George Putnam asked for her hand in marriage, Earnhardt accepted it under the condition that he signed a contract guaranteeing that he would respect her desires for maximum freedom within the relationship. People who met her invariably commented that she was not really masculine or feminine or even androgynous, but completely herself, a unique mix of qualities. It was this part of her that fascinated people and kept her in the limelight. In 1937, she attempted the riskiest flight of her career, to circle the world via the equator, including the stopover on a tiny island in the Pacific. She disappeared somewhere near the island, never to be found, all of which only add to the legend of Earnhardt as a consummate risk-taker who would do everything to get her way. Understand, the day you were born, you became engaged in a struggle that continues to this day and will determine your success or failure in life. You are an individual with ideas and skills that make you unique, but people are constantly trying to fit you into narrow categories that make you more predictable and easier to manage. They want to see you as shy or outgoing, sensitive or tough. If you succumb to this pressure, then you may gain some social acceptance, but you will lose the unconventional parts of your character that are the source of your uniqueness and power. You must resist this process at all costs, seeing people's neat and tidy judgments as a form of confinement. Your task is to retain or rediscover those aspects of your character that defy character's categorization and to give them even greater play. Remaining unique, you will create something unique and inspire the kind of respect you will never receive from tepid conformity. The second strategy is constantly reinventing yourself. As a child, the future President John F. Kennedy was extremely frail and prone to illness. He spent much of his time in various hospitals and grew up to be rather frail and weak-looking. From these experiences, he developed a horror of anything that made him feel that he had no control over his life. And one form of powerlessness particularly irked him. The judgments people made of him based on his appearance, they would see him as weak and fragile, underestimating his underlying strength of character. So he initiated a lifelong process of wrestling wresting this control from others, constantly recreating himself and casting the image that he wanted people to see of him. As a youth, he was perceived as the pleasure-loving son of a powerful father. So at the outbreak of World War II, despite the physical limitations, he enlisted in the Navy and determined to show another side of himself. As a lieutenant on a patrol torpedo in the Pacific, his boat was rammed and cut by a Japanese destroyer. He proceeded to lead his men to safety, and in a way it earned him numerous medals for bravery. During this incident, he displayed an almost callous disregard for his own life, perhaps in an attempt for once and for all to prove his masculinity. In 1946, he decided to run for Congress, and he used this war record to craft his image of a young man who would be an equally fearless fighter for his constituency. A few years later, as a senator, he realized that many in the public perceived him as a bit of a lightweight, young and unproven, and so yet again he chose to reinvent himself, this time by writing a book authored with his speechwriter Theodore Sorensen, called The Profiles in Courage, cataloging stories of famous senators who defied convention and achieved great things. The book won a Pulitzer Prize, and most important, it completely altered the image that the public had of Kennedy. He was now seen as a thoughtful and independent, somehow following the path of the senators had written about, clearly an intended effect. In 1960, when Kennedy was running for president, people once again underestimated him. They saw him as the young Catholic liberal senator who could not possibly appeal to the majority of Americans. This time, he decided to recast himself as the inspiring prophet who would lead the country out of the doldrums of the Eisenhower era, returning to America to its frontier roots and creating a sense of unified purpose. It was an image of vigor and youth, contrary to its still weakness, and it proved compelling enough to captivate the public and win the election. Understand, people judge you by appearances, the image that you project through your actions, words, and style. If you do not take control of this process, then people will see and define you the way they want to, often to your detriment. You might think that that being consistent with this image will make others respect and trust you, but in fact it is the opposite. Over time, you seem predictable and weak. Consistency is an illusion anyway. Each passing day brings changes within you. You must not be afraid to express these evolutions. The powerful learn early in life that they have the freedom to mold their image, fitting the needs and moods of the moment. In this way, they keep others off balance and maintain an air of mystery. You must follow this path and find a great pleasure in reinventing yourself as if you were the author writing your own drama. And the third strategy, I believe, is subvert your patterns. Animals depend on instincts and habits to survive. We as humans depend on our conscious, rational thinking, which gives us greater freedom of action, the ability to alter our behavior according to circumstance. And yet, that animal part of our nature, the compulsion to repeat the same things, tends to dominate our way of thinking. We succumb to mental patterns, which makes our actions repetitive as well. This was the problem that the great architect Frank Lloyd Wright was obsessed with, and he came up with a powerful solution. As a young architect in the 1890s, Wright could not understand why most people in his profession chose to design buildings based on patterns. Houses had to follow a certain model, determined by the materials and cost. One style became popular, and people copied it endlessly. Living in such a house or working in such offices would make people feel soulless like cogs in a machine. In nature, no two trees are ever the same. A forest is formed in a kind of random fashion, and that is beauty. And that is its beauty. Wright was determined to follow this organic model rather than a mass-produced model of the machine age. Despite the cost and energy, he decided that no two buildings of his would ever be in the same way, never be the same in any way. He would extend this to his own behavior and interactions with others. He took delight in being capricious and doing the opposite of what colleagues and clients expected from him. This eccentric manner of working led to the creation of the revolutionary designs that made him the most famous architect of his time. In 1934, he was commissioned by Edgar Kaufman, a Pittsburgh department store magnate, to design a vacation house facing the waterfall on Bear Creek in rural Pennsylvania. Wright needed to see the design in his mind before he could commit it to paper. For this project, nothing would come to him, and so he decided to play a game on himself. He simply ignored the work. Months went by. Finally, Kaufman had enough and telephoned Wright. He demanded to see the design. Wright exclaimed that it was finished. Kaufman said he would be over in 2 hours to look it over. Wright's associates were aghast. He had not yet penciled in one line. Nonplussed and with a rush of creative energy, he began to design the house. It would not face the waterfall, he decided, but stand over and incorporate it. When Kaufman saw the design, he was delighted. The house became known as Falling Water, often associated with Wright's most beautiful creation. In essence, Wright had forced his mind to face a problem without research or preconceptions, completely in the moment. It was an exercise to free himself from the prior habits and create something totally new. What often prevents us from using the mental fluidity and freedom that we naturally possess are the physical routines in our lives. We see the same people and do the same things, and our minds follow these patterns. The solution then is to break this up. For instance, we could deliberately indulge in some random, even irrational act, perhaps doing the very opposite of what we would normally do in our day-to-day life. By taking an action we have never done before, we place ourselves in unfamiliar territory. Our minds naturally awaken to the novel situation. In a similar vein, we can force ourselves to take different routes, visit strange places, encounter different people, wake up at odd hours, or read books that challenge our minds instead of dull them. We should practice this when we feel particularly blocked and uncreative. In such moments, it is best to be ruthless with ourselves and our patterns. The fourth strategy is create a sense of destiny. In the year 1428, soldiers stationed at the garrison at the French town of Vaucouleurs began to receive visits from a 16-year-old girl named Jeanne d'Arc, or Joan of Arc. She was the daughter of the lowly peasants from a nearby poor village, and she repeated to those soldiers the same message. She had been chosen by God to rescue France from the desperate state it had fallen into. In the previous years, the country had become overrun by English invaders, who had now held the French king hostage in England. The English were on the verge of conquering the key French city of Orleans. The Dauphin, heir to the French throne, was languishing at the castle in the country, choosing to do nothing. Joan had different visions from the various saints who explained to her precisely what she must do. Convinced the Dauphin to give her troops to lead to Orleans, defeat the English there, and led the Dauphin to Reims, where he would be crowned the new king of France, to be known as Charles VII. Many people in France at the time were having such visions, and the soldiers who listened to Joan could not help but feel skeptical. But Joan was different from the others. Despite the soldiers' lack of interest, she kept returning to her usual message. Nothing could discourage her. She was fearless, moving unescorted among so many restless soldiers. She spoke plainly, like any peasant girl, but there was not a shred of doubt in her voice, and her eyes were lit up with conviction. She was certain of these visions and would not rest until she had fulfilled her destiny. Her explanations of what she would do were so detailed that they They seemed to have a weight of reality. And so, a few soldiers came to believe that she was real and set in motion a chain of events. They convinced the local governor to allow them to escort her to Defying. The Dauphin eventually believed her story as well and gave her the troops she requested. The citizens of Orleans, convinced she was destined to be the savior, rallied to her side and helped her to defeat the English. The momentum she brought to the French side continued well over a year until she was captured and sold to the English, and after a lengthy trial, burned at the stake as a witch. The story of Joan d'Arc demonstrates a simple principle: the higher your self-belief, the more your power to transform reality. Having supreme confidence makes you fearless and persistent, allowing you to overcome obstacles that stop most people in their tracks. It makes soldiers believe in you as well. And the most intense form of self-belief is to feel a sense of destiny impelling you forward. This destiny can come from otherworldly sources or come from yourself. Think of it in these terms. You have a set of skills and experiences that make you unique. They point you towards some life tasks that you were meant to accomplish. You see the signs in this predilections of your youth, certain tasks you are naturally drawn to. When you are involved in this task, everything seems to flow more naturally. Believing you are destined to accomplish something does not make you passive or unfree, but the opposite. You are liberated of the normal doubts and confusions that plague us. You have a sense of purpose that guides you, but does not chain you to one way of doing things. And when your willpower is so deeply engaged, it will push you past any limits or dangers. And the fifth and final strategy is bet on yourself. It is always easy to rationalize your own doubts and conservative instincts, particularly when times are rough. You will convince yourself that it is foolhardy to take risks, that it is better to wait when circumstances are more propitious. But this is a dangerous mentality. It signifies an overall lack of confidence in yourself that will carry over to better times. You will find it hard to rouse yourself of your defensive posture. The truth is that the greatest inventions and advances in technology or business generally come in negative periods because there is a greater necessity for creative thinking and radical solutions that break with the past. These are moments that are ripe with opportunity. While others retrench and retreat, you must think of taking risks, trying new things, and looking at the future that will come out of a present crisis. You must always be prepared to place a bet on yourself, on your future, by heading in the direction that others seem to fear. This means that you believe that if you fail, you have the inner resources to recover. This belief acts as a kind of mental safety net. When you move ahead on some new venture or direction, your mind will snap to attention, your energy will be focused and intense. By making yourself feel the necessity to be creative, your mind will rise to the occasion. Reversal of perspective. For most of us, the words ego and egotism express something negative. Egotistical people have an oversized opinion of themselves. Instead of considering what is important for society, a group, or family, they think first and foremost of themselves and act upon this. And their vision is narrowed to the point of seeing everything in reference to their needs and desires. Yeah. But there is another way to look at it. We all have an ego, a sense of who we are, and this ego or self-relationship is either strong or weak. People with the weak ego do not have a secure sense of their worth or potential. They pay attention to the opinions of others. They may perceive anything as a personal attack or affront. They need constant attention and validation from others. To compensate for and disguise this fragility, they will often assume an arrogant, aggressive front. This needy, dependent, self-obsessed variety of ego is what we find irritating and distasteful. A strong ego, however, is completely different. People who have a solid sense of their own value and who feel secure about themselves have the capacity to look at the world with a greater objectivity. They could be more considerate and thoughtful because they can get outside of themselves. People with a strong ego set up boundaries, and a sense of pride will not allow them to accept manipulative or hurtful behavior. We generally like to be around such types. Their confidence and strength is contagious. To have such a strong ego should be an ideal for all of us. So many people who attain the heights of power in this culture, celebrities for instance, have to make a show of false humility and honesty and modesty, as if they got far as they did by accident and not by ego or ambition. They want to act as if they are no different from anyone else and almost embarrassed by their power and success. These are all signs of a weak ego. In egotists of the strong variety, you trumpet your individuality and take great pride in your accomplishments. If others cannot help that or judge you as arrogant, that's their problem, not yours. And here's a quote by Henry Bergson. We are free when our acts proceed from our entire personality, when they express it, and when they exhibit that undeniable resemblance to it which we find occasionally between an artist and his work.